Hello, everyone.
Hello again. We're in the last subhead of Ray Franz's chapter, The Misuse of Disfellowshipping and In Search of Christian Freedom. That is page 387. And the subhead is A Regrettable Misdirection of Zeal. Among Jehovah's Witnesses, there are hundreds, thousands of persons who need and would greatly benefit from upbuilding, helpful aid that would contribute toward their developing the strength and understanding to meet personal problems that seriously affect their lives. As will be discussed in a later chapter, while there is much boasting of the spiritual paradise supposedly found within the international organization, a survey of most congregations would reveal that witnesses as a collective society are in no way free from the social stress and problems affecting people in general. The large files at the Watchtower's Brooklyn headquarters contain abundant evidence of this, and their volume grows with each passing year. Much is made of the policy of disfellowshipping unrepentant wrongdoers as proof of concern for maintaining a clean organization. But simply to amputate offending members of a body, however, is no sign of overall health, and certainly no proof of curative powers.
I like that. That's funny. There are definitely elders among the witness community who feel moved to give personal attention and remedial help that might avoid any call for punitive action, or to give simply the kind of Christian encouragement and comfort that so many need. There are elders who feel that they can rightly take the time for doing so, and who are equipped spiritually and scripturally to supply such help. The truly regrettable fact is that such elders are so rare. The system itself, its view of itself, and the spirit that results simply do not favor this kind of person. The criteria of selecting elders gives virtually no consideration to the desirable qualities described, focusing largely on how active candidates are, not in giving kind help to others, but in the organization's programs. As a result, most elders are or have become merely organization men, concerned only with following the organization line, with much prodding of the sheep to follow that line, but with only perfunctory help and very little in the way of comfort or refreshment. Their role has been converted by a religious system from that of spiritual shepherds to spiritual taskmasters. The failure to recognize the scriptural truths that Christian salvation is not predicated on some program of works, that Christian deeds must be spontaneously motivated by faith and love, and not by external pressures, and that Christians are not under law, but under God's undeserved kindness. It is this failure that lies at the root of the problem.
I do not question the sincerity of many of these men. Actually, a growing number of witness elders have been moved by conscience to resign their eldership. The evidence is that the organization is losing many of its more compassionate men, and the long-term effects of this will not be helpful. In many congregations, more and more comparatively young men are becoming elders, and often the resulting situation proves like that in biblical times, when King Rehoboam received wise counsel for moderation from older men, but preferred to go with that of younger men who favored a tough, authoritarian stance.
Similarly, as regards many of those congregation members who, because of holding to organizational norms, have coldly cut off former friends and even family members from fellowship, doing this even where they knew that the only sin of such ones was their inability to accept conscientiously certain teachings or practices as scriptural. I am sure that many do this with deep pain. Here too there are those who eventually begin to ask themselves if their course is really exemplary of the attitude of God's Son.
In 1985, A couple in Maine, who had left hippie life to become witnesses, wrote of their being attracted to the organization because of its apparent warmth and openness. They auxiliary pioneered frequently, gave their 100% in all respects, so that, as their letter states, quote, "We soon realized our home was nothing more than a motel room, a place to rush to after the long drive home from meetings, and a place to grab a bite in before rushing off to drop the kids at school and go out in field service." End of quote. Yet none of this disturbed them. What did were experiences of a different kind. As the wife writes, quote, "The first was a situation out in service. A sister witness and I visited a dying witness in the hospital. A well-dressed younger man happened to be there to visit also, so we spoke with him. It turned out that he was the man's son and a former witness. In our brief, needless to say, conversation with him, he mentioned that he'd simply had some questions that he wanted answered, and that after several sessions trying to get answers, had been disfellowshipped. This was in 1981. What amazes me now, looking back, is that all the sister and I were really concerned about was that we stopped speaking to him very quickly, as we were supposed to do. I didn't even think of how he must have felt about his dying father."
Her husband, Kim, found himself forced to reassess his views by an experience with a Polish witness who had been in concentration camps during World War II. She asked him if she could speak to him after one congregational meeting. The letter relates, quote, "She began crying soon after we started talking. She rode to work every morning with her disfellowshipped son, and with all the new understanding, that is, the Society's 1981 more rigid policy towards disfellowshipped persons, she was having a wretched time with her relationship with him. Another son was an elder in our congregation and took a hard line, and yet another son was dying of cancer. The thought of rejecting the disfellowshipped son was just more than she could bear. My husband, Kim, later commented that if an organization were really teaching the love that Christ taught us we should have, an occasion like that would never have arisen, because there was no compassion in it.
Once a judicial hearing produces a verdict for disfellowshipping, the organizational policy, in effect, calls on all witnesses, even though having no knowledge of what was said in the secret hearing, to participate in a figurative stoning of the one condemned, treating him as though dead as long as he is in the disfellowshipped state. I would think that any person having genuine respect for the heavenly judge and his son, before whose judgment seat we must all eventually appear, would think seriously about their individual responsibility when called on to cast their personal stone, particularly if they have any question in their hearts as to the condemned one's being truly a wicked person.
Having been through the experience of such stoning myself, I believe I can understand how many feel. And yet I believe that our own respect for our superior judges, God and Christ, as well as our own compassion and humility, can temper whatever sense of resentment we might feel. It may well cause us to take up the words of God's Son and of his disciple, Stephen, and say with them, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." It is not that congregational elders or those who are simply members have no responsibility before God for their actions. They do, and it is a responsibility they cannot pass on to an organization and its leaders. But the degree of blindness affecting them is something we cannot know, something only the heavenly reader of hearts can determine. I personally prefer to embrace that outlook. I find life happier as a result.
Yeah, I'm continually amazed by how Ray could continually and consistently give the benefit of the doubt.
Mm-hmm.
He gives the benefit of the doubt to everybody, and I can't say I can remember a single instance in the 2 books where he turns it on somebody and judges them as to their intentions.
Yeah, he does seem to think in terms of the fact that you were once a witness and you held some of these positions, and you may have treated people badly. So we have to take responsibility for that. I like the way he talks about when you participate in treating someone who's disfellowshipped the way the Watchtower wants you to, you're like stoning him. And that makes you responsible for how you treated people. So this whole thing made me realize that all of us have a hard time forgiving people. It's not just witnesses and ex-witnesses, but all people have trouble forgiving people.
I like his last line too.
If you don't treat people with forgiveness, though, it eats you alive. You become bitter and an unhappy person, and who wants that? So his spirit is a more generous spirit that helps you get past that. I remember in giving my testimony one time at my workplace, which was a Christian workplace, and a Christian woman coming up to me after the testimony saying, "I don't know how you can forgive them." So this is someone who knows the words of Christ about forgiveness. And yet, when unhappy things happen, it's difficult not to be bitter.
Well, that's why we need Ray Franz, who's continually reminding us of this higher standard, which after all is the standard of, as he says here, Christ and Stephen, who said, "For our Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing."
Yeah.
Only by judging that they do know what they're doing can we say, well, that doesn't apply. But 1 Corinthians 13 again, why does Paul have to tell the disciples to be loving?
Yeah.
After all, Christ also says that the love is poured out in our hearts by the Holy Spirit. But in Corinth and in every other congregation we've ever been in, there's a problem. Some people have a problem with forgiving, yet Corinthians plainly says that love bears all things, it believes all things, that is, it gives the benefit of the doubt, and it endures all things.
So I remember when I read Ray's book, and I think his books were the first ones that had that more gentle approach and more loving approach, understanding and giving the benefit of the doubt. How much easier it was for me to learn the facts about the Watchtower because of the way Ray wrote. His tone impressed me. It was believable, it was truthful, and yet not harsh. And when we are negative, we tend to go over the top in our negativity. We go beyond it. He was very, very direct about what was wrong, but kind about people. And that helped me to be able to take an honest look even at myself and where I was guilty, where I was not having a Christian attitude.
We're going to put on the screen a link to a video we did in the Daniel series on the blame game, because one of the things we learned when we looked at the Old Testament without Watchtower glasses for the first time was that the prophets and the leaders of Israel that we think of as saints, like Daniel, Nehemiah, Isaiah, when they prayed, they took part of the blame, the guilt for Israel. They didn't point the finger at their fellow Jews and say, "Get those guys, Lord." They seemed to feel there was a community guilt, and it was even on them, despite the fact that when you're a witness, and even in reality, those men are relatively blameless. I can't think of a single sin that Daniel is recorded as committing. But nevertheless, look at the video, look at the prayer, even more important, in Daniel chapter 9, where Daniel prays for God to release his people, and how he thinks of himself as part of the guilty community. So that video on the blame game is on your screen. And in the next, we're going into a new chapter, which is indoctrination and subordination.